With the Nintendo Switch 2 having just been announced, a lot of people are wondering what the future of the Pokemon series will look like. You know, maybe they're looking for this new console to save the Pokemon franchise. If you're a casual player, you might be a bit unaware, but pretty much every Pokemon game since like 2019 has been shrouded in pretty major controversy. And it all started with this stupid little tree, but that's a story for another time. Following poorly received entries like Sword and Shield and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet made a bold change to the series formula, becoming fully open world and embracing less linear gameplay. The game's story was also one of the most entertaining and memorable of any Pokemon game in a long time, but even despite this, critics and fans of the franchise were generally really disappointed by the game's embarrassingly bad graphics and awful performance. Even after countless patches, bug fixes, and hours of additional content added through DLC, Scarlet and Violet still runs terribly and looks even worse. For many players, the solution is quite simple. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet need an update or a remaster for the upcoming Nintendo Switch 2. With the console confirmed to be backwards compatible, allowing it to play games released for the first Nintendo Switch, this seems like the perfect opportunity to fix the trust that modern Pokemon games seem to have broken in many fans. The Nintendo Switch 2 will definitely have the hardware required to fix Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I mean, plenty of rumors have been flying around for the past few months, speculating that the Nintendo Switch 2 will be much more powerful than its predecessor. But even without these upgrades, just look at any other game on the Switch. Some of these are multiple years older, but they look so much better and run perfectly. With a remaster on the Switch 2, Pokemon can finally fix all of the ugly graphics and poor performance, helping fans to become much more excited for future entries in the series like Legend ZA and the inevitable Generation 10 games. Talking about Legend ZA actually, a lot of people are assuming that it's releasing on the Nintendo Switch 2, but that's actually not the case. Before we get into that though, I'm sure you know how crazy 2025 is gonna be between the Nintendo Switch 2 and Pokemon Legend ZA. If I were in your shoes, I'd probably scroll down right about now and click the subscribe button. If you don't, you might miss some of the biggest Pokemon news of the year. It's interesting to speculate about what Pokemon will look like on the Switch 2 because we actually have no idea. We could make a guess depending on how Legend ZA looks, but it's actually pretty safe to assume that Legend ZA won't release on the Switch 2, despite the fact that they are likely being released around the same time. There are two main pillars to this argument, the first being that 7 of the 8 generations of Pokemon all stay on the same platform. Every Generation 1 game is on the Game Boy, Generation 2 stays on the Game Boy Color, Generation 3 on the GBA, Generations 4 and 5 on the DS, Generation 6 on the 3DS, and Generation 8 on the Switch. The only exception to this rule was Generation 7, starting on the 3DS with Pokemon Sun and Moon, but ending on the Switch with Let's Go. And second, Pokemon games don't tend to be released on new consoles. The franchise waited over a year to bring Pokemon to the Nintendo Switch, and over 2 years for the DS and 3DS. Pokemon has never been a launch title for any console before, except for Pokemon Dash, but I don't think that really counts. So if Pokemon Legend ZA releases on the Nintendo Switch, then what comes next? Well, we actually do have a pretty good idea of when Legend ZA is releasing, and I've got a video covering this topic coming out very soon, but to put it simply, it's likely releasing around July or August. If you want to know why, well, you'll have to subscribe. Following its release, we can also assume that Legend ZA will get a substantial free update, or DLC as some people would call it, similar to Legends Arceus' Daybreak update, which was released a month after the game itself alongside the 2022 Pokemon Day celebrations in February. Keeping this in mind, we can assume the update for Legend ZA will either release a few months after its release or around February in 2026 to coincide with Pokemon Day yet again. Talking about Pokemon Day in 2026, this is likely when we'll get the first announcement for Pokemon's 10th generation of games. If it's anything like the release trailer for Scarlet and Violet, this will show us a few shots of what the game will look like, you know, hopefully much better than Scarlet and Violet does. as well as the game's starter Pokemon. Then, later in the year, the Generation 10 titles will be released, likely around November 2026, but there's still a good chance these games will not release on the Nintendo Switch 2. If we take our theoretical release date, November 2026, we know that this is around a year and a half after the Nintendo Switch 2 will have been released. But as we mentioned earlier, Pokemon games don't tend to be released on new consoles until somewhere between 1 and 2 years has passed. This places Generation 10 right on the threshold, possibly released on the Switch, possibly released on the Switch 2. I imagine one small thing will tip this balance pretty quickly though, and that's the fact that releasing these games on the Nintendo Switch is actually a much safer option financially. The Nintendo Switch has currently sold around 146 million units at the time of making this video, which means there are approximately 146 million potential customers for new Pokemon games. I know that's not like actually how it works, but you know, let's say for the sake of the argument, there's one Switch per customer. So if we say that hypothetically the Nintendo Switch 2 launches with around 50 million units, if you then release a game exclusively for the Nintendo Switch 2, there's only a market of 50 million customers. If you release the game on the base Nintendo Switch, you now have an audience almost triple the size, with 146 million customers, and the 50 million of them that own the Switch 2 can still enjoy the game on the new, faster, and better performing console. Does that make sense? I really hope I explained that correctly. There's a lot of rumors flying around at the moment that support this idea as well, with the most popular idea being that Legend ZA and Generation 10 will release on the Nintendo Switch, but will receive remasters or ports on the Nintendo Switch 2, I imagine making them look nicer or run better. As for anything past this, your guess is as good as mine, I suppose. I imagine that a few months after Generation 10 releases, its DLC will be announced in February 2027. After releasing later in the same year, the next Pokemon Day in 2028 will be focused on future entries in Generation 10. And I imagine that's when we'll get our first exclusive Nintendo Switch 2 Pokemon games, whether it be remakes for Black and White or a new Legends game, or both. But instead of focusing on the future, how about we focus on the past? A popular idea for the Nintendo Switch has always been the idea of bringing back the older games that you can't buy anymore. For context, Pokemon did this on the 3DS, releasing the Generation 1 titles to celebrate the series' 20th anniversary in 2016, followed by the Generation 2 titles being released around a year later. I think one of the main issues with this, though, is the fact that these games were released on the 3DS at the very end of its lifespan, with the Nintendo Switch being released in early 2017. If the Nintendo Switch 2 drops with immediate access to old Pokemon games, perhaps Generations 1, 2, and 3, it would be an incredibly well-received decision, and I think could even slightly boost the sales of the Nintendo Switch 2. I would include Generations 4 and 5 as well, but you know, since Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are already on the Switch, and Black and White are likely to get remakes or remasters on the Nintendo Switch 2, I wouldn't exactly say they're top priorities right now. With all of those games in mind, the only region that would be missing on the Nintendo Switch 2 would be Generation 7's Alola region, since Legend ZA covers the Kalos region. It's really interesting to speculate on what the next Pokemon games are going to look like, but I really wish we could learn more about the new Mega Evolutions coming to Pokemon Legends ZA. If you're in the same boat as me, you know, there's actually a video on screen you can click right now that will tell you about a possible hint towards Mega Luxray in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I know, it sounds really cool, you should really go watch it.